Hello everybody, and I hope you can all hear me. I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and I'd also like to extend a very special thanks to our invited speakers, Barbara Bamberger, who is the Forestry lead for the Offsets program at the California Air Resources Board, and Olaf Kugler from the Forest Inventory and Analysis program of the U.S. Forest Service. Today's agenda, we'll start with, oops, sorry about that. Okay. Sorry, I have to go back a little. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. So today's agenda, we'll start with a short introduction from me, and then this will be followed by Barbara, who will provide a summary of the recent changes to the Forest Protocol adopted by the board last month, as well as a summary of the proposed changes to the protocol that will be part of the upcoming December 2014 rulemaking process. Olaf Kugler will then provide us with an overview of the FIA's update process. And then this will be followed by Barbara again, who will speak about how the common practice values were updated in the Forest Protocol recently and will be part of the December rulemaking package. After the presentations, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions and have them answered, and Stuart McMorrow from ACR will coordinate the Q&A. In terms of logistics for the webinar, participants can ask questions at any time during the webinar presentations by simply typing their questions into the chat box, which is located near the bottom of your webinar pane. Please include your name and organization when asking a question, and your questions will be then directed to the appropriate person during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We'll try our hardest to answer all of the questions during the Q&A, but for any questions that remain unanswered, we will follow up via email after the webinar. And finally, all of the presentations will be recorded and will be sent to all registered participants after the webinar. So I'll start off by providing a short introduction to ACR and our role in the California Cap and Trade program. ACR, I think this is, ACR is part of Winrock International. Winrock is a nonprofit organization that was formed in 1985 by 3 Rockefeller family organizations. Winrock International is dedicated to economic development and resource management in the U.S. and around the world. The organization places a strong emphasis on climate change impacts and adaptation and environmental markets. ACR was the first private voluntary greenhouse gas registry founded in 1996, and it became part of Winrock International in 2007. ACR's activities include developing and approving carbon offset methodologies and standards, overseeing project verifications, and reviewing and registering offset projects, including issuing and retiring serialized offsets. In December 2012, ACR was approved by the Air Resources Board of California as an OPR, or Offset Project Registry. ACR then opened an office in Sacramento in May 2012. As an Offset Project Registry, or OPR, ACR receives listing forms from ARB compliance offset projects and project documentation from early action projects. ACR reviews and approves listing forms, verification reports, and verification statements, and offset project data reports. We also issue registry offset credits, or ROCs. ROCs are then canceled on our registry when ARB is ready to issue our box onto the KITS, or Compliance Instrument Tracking System Service, which is administered by ARB. ACR staff have, sorry, sorry about that. ACR staff have strong technical expertise in forestry, as well as all of the other compliance protocols. We place a strong emphasis on providing quick and accurate feedback to stakeholders. ACR has an open channel of communication with ARB to address questions and technical issues quickly as they arise. We currently have 7 team members that have successfully completed the ARB Forest Offset Protocol training. And as a part of Winrock, ACR can draw upon Winrock's additional expertise in forest carbon, energy, and agriculture. ACR has an entirely dedicated team that is dedicated to forestry projects, comprised of 3 individuals. We are highly technical and all have very complementary skills, and we have strong relationships with key forestry and carbon stakeholders. And we work very hard to keep all of these stakeholders informed of changes or technical issues or other relevant information. ACR's registry fees are quite competitive. It is especially important to note here that ACR does not have an issuance fee. We charge no fees at the time of issuance, but rather we charge both an activation and cancellation fee when ARB is ready to issue our bucks. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I want to encourage participants to contact ACR's forestry team or other team members with questions. And if your questions are not about forestry, we'll direct them to the right technical staff members. Thank you all. We will now switch over to Barbara from ARB, who will give us an update on the recent and proposed changes to the U.S. Forest Compliance Offsets Protocol. Thanks, Barb.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. So ARB has been engaged in 2 separate update processes for the Compliance Offset Protocol for U.S. forests. Next slide. The September 2014 rulemaking package was the first update. The upcoming December rulemaking, of which the initial staff proposal has not yet been released, is the second protocol update. Today, we're going to discuss the updates resulting from the September rulemaking, the schedule and process for the December rulemaking package, including when the initial staff proposal will be released for public comment, common practice, and how it was originally and is currently derived and what is included in it. The September rulemaking package was released this summer, which started a 45-day public comment period on August 1st. The update was restricted to updating quantification methodologies only, and therefore we call this the quantification methodology, or QM update. The quantification methodology update was heard at the board hearing held on September 18th. During this board hearing, staff was directed to delay updates to the common practice values, as well as the update to how projects are stratified by low and high site class stratification. The board approved for adoption all proposed modifications with the exception of common practice and how projects must stratify by site class. That language remains the same as in the current version dated October 2011. For any QM update, ARB is not required to go through a traditional rulemaking. This is because updates to quantification methodologies are exempt from the Administrative Procedures Act. Even so, ARB elected to publish the QM updates with the rest of the regulatory updates to provide for greater transparency and to allow time for public comments. Public comments are now being accepted on modified language as part of a 15-day comment period. If approved by the Executive Office, proposed changes to the Forest Protocol and all other regulatory amendments will go into effect January 1st, 2015. The September quantification methodology updates were the first update to the Forest Protocol. Next slide, please. whoa. I think he went to the last, there you go. Okay, in 2 weeks, we will be releasing the December rulemaking package, which is the second of the 2 protocol updates. This December rulemaking requires 2 board hearings, as our main objective of this package is to, 1, add regions of Alaska to the protocol, which requires CEQA review and findings prior to board adoption, and 2, update common practice values and how projects are stratified, creating both greater consistency between the portions of the protocol and updating according to the latest science and data. Staff will release its initial proposal on October 21st. A 45-day public comment period will begin on October 24th, when the public may submit written comments on the proposed rulemaking. Staff will present the proposed updates at the December board hearing on either December 11th or 12th in Sacramento.
18th or 19th. 18th or 19th.
On September 18th or 19th in Sacramento. Notification will go out when the proposed updates are publicly released and the comment period begins. A second board hearing will occur as part of CEQA review in mid-2015. Staff will hold public workshops and meet with the public on technical issues following the December workshop in 2015. Project operators may join the Cap and Trade listserv and will receive notices on all rulemaking activities and deadlines. This information will allow you to keep track of any workshops, board hearings, and public comment period for the Forest Protocol and related topics. Next slide, please. Okay. Next. Next slide. Okay, there you go. So how will you know which protocol version to use? For projects that list prior to January 1st, 2015, if a project lists prior to January 1st, 2015, the project would continue to update under the current October 2011 protocol. OPOs are not required to upgrade their project using the new updated quantification methodology protocol. They can choose to update their project, but they are not required to. 2, for projects listed on or after January 1st, the OPO must use the protocol version approved for adoption by the board in September. Again, this includes any changes that occurred after the board hearing following board direction in September. This means that the QM update, effective January 1, includes the original common practice values. For existing projects, either current or using the January 1st protocol, existing projects may continue to use the protocol they are currently using, or they have the option to update their project using the latest protocol versions. New projects must always use the latest protocol. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to go over the key elements that were approved by the board in September and will potentially go into effect January 1st. There was primarily 3 key elements of the protocol that were proposed in the September package. The first 2 were adopted, and the third was moved to the December board package. The first are improvements to how a project's standing deadwood carbon pool is accounted for projects in all states except for California, Oregon, and Washington. The second is a simplification of how regional volume models and biomass equations are identified and selected. And the third is updating common practice values for each assessment area. The first update was to develop a standardized approach for using the standing dead tree carbon pool. Using an approach published by the U.S. Forest Service Inventory and Analysis Program, or FIA, OPOs will need to adjust for density reduction and structural loss from decomposition for all standing dead trees. FIA published reports that found that absent these adjustments, tree and plot level carbon stock estimates were overestimated by 36 to 50% for the standing dead tree carbon pool. Although standing dead trees represent typically 3% or less of a project's total carbon estimate, AB 32 requires that ARB ensure that offset credits are real. We made this change to ensure conservative accounting and to continue to meet the requirements of AB 32. The image on this slide shows the plot locations across the United States that accounted for sampling done by FIA, which established the basis of the study that led to the adopted adjustment factors. Next slide. The steps on these slides represent the required approach to establishing density and structural loss adjustments for standing dead trees. I won't go into the details of how to use this approach during this presentation. That will be done another time and through guidance. But you can review the slide steps on your own and read through the Domke paper and the Domke worksheet, which will be provided on our supplemental documents webpage. The key element of the Domke paper is that the two adjustment factors, density reduction and structural loss adjustments, are applied during the first step, conversion to sound volume and biomass, so that all above ground tree components are adjusted for density and bark structural loss by decay class. And once those adjustments are applied, then structural loss adjustment for tops and limbs, stump and roots, and other tree components are incorporated separately. This avoids double deductions. The Domke adjustment factors are only applied to projects outside California, Oregon, and Washington. For projects in California, Oregon, and Washington, you will continue to use the Harmon decay class, but you will use the 2011 Harmon paper rather than the 2008 paper. Next slide, please. The second change proposed and adopted by the board simplifies how offset project operators identify volume equations for each species. For projects in all states except California, Oregon, and Washington, OPOs will now use the Woodall paper to find the correct volume equation by species. Once volume is estimated, you will continue to use the component ratio method to determine biomass estimates, as always. For projects in California, Oregon, and Washington, we have updated the regional volume and biomass equations, and OPOs will use the updated equations, not the old equations and not the equations assigned to California, Oregon, or Washington within the Woodall paper. We've done this with the purpose of simplifying and removing the need to contact ARB for review and approval of equations for missing species. This will effectively eliminate two documents currently used with the 2011 adopted protocol for any new protocol users. One is the cubic foot volume equation for the U.S. outside of California, Oregon, and Washington, and the other document is the volume equation references and coefficients by species for supersections outside of California, Oregon, and Washington. Next slide, please. The Woodall paper follows the U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory Program's data collection conducted by the Forest Service FIA program. This map indicates how FIA divides the U.S. into 4 regions: the Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountain or Interior West, the Northern, and the Southern region. Each region has its own lookup table within the Woodall paper. If, for example, a project is located in New Hampshire, the same volume equation will be used for all species found in New Hampshire, unless it otherwise specifies that a species needs to use a different volume equation. Now, coefficients will change, however. The coefficients that are assigned to a species for one region will be different for another region. The Woodall paper incorporates all volume equations in the U.S. by region and by reference author. The paper includes a database that you can download from our webpage of coefficients by species and by region. OPOs will need to get used to using the database, as the same species is listed in multiple regions because a particular species may grow in multiple regions. But if you don't go to the correct regional worksheet, you're going to end up using the wrong coefficient. FIA's network of permanent inventory plots across the U.S. is what ARB uses as a basis for common practice for IFM projects. This change will allow projects that were unable to have full carbon accounting for all species in their project area when there were missing equations or missing species that we could not approve, eliminating the need for project operators to have to leave the carbon out of the project. For projects located in California, Oregon, and Washington, project operators will need to be sure to replace your regional volume and biomass equations with the updated version identified by the date September 19, 2014. You will want to be particularly careful not to use the equations referenced for California, Oregon, and Washington within the Woodall paper. The Woodall paper is only adopted for the remaining 45 states. Next slide, please. The third key update proposed was the Common Practice Value Update. The Common Practice Value Update was delayed and will be incorporated in the December rulemaking package. Next slide. Common practice values were adopted by the board as part of the original cap-and-trade regulation adopted on October 20th, 2011. They were originally developed and adopted by the Climate Action Reserve in 2009. Data that went into the current common practice values are based upon 2002 to 2006 data. AB 32 requires that all offset credits must be real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, additional, and enforceable. Common practice values are meant to reflect harvest, growth, disturbances specific to a particular geographical region, and within a similar forest community or communities, and reflect a particular regional wood product market. The term common practice demonstrates a business-as-usual scenario within that particular assessment area. The board directed staff to periodically review protocols and update to the latest science and data. Therefore, the proposed update began to be consistent with the latest update to more adequately reflect business as usual within each assessment area. Next slide, please. As 8 years have ensued since the original data, common practice values needed to be updated to reflect the most up-to-date market conditions within an assessment area. We began with an extensive analysis, a review, a QA/QC process, and reanalysis beginning in late 2013. We reviewed existing data and we reviewed new data. In updating the common practice values, our goal was to adequately reflect growth, harvest, fire, and other disturbances in conversion, and also allow for a smoothing out of fluctuations over a 10-year period of time. The common practice values are derived from standing live tree carbon stocks, data taken from private lands, and with data that ranges from 2002 to 2012 on a per acre basis. FIA does collect data on public lands as well, but for this purpose, we only used private lands data. Common practice estimates are established from a ratio of average annual estimates for a rolling 5-year period for the West, 7-year period for the South, and 10-year period for the East. Olaf is going to go into this in more detail. When we reviewed the original site class groupings, we found that we needed to develop a reliable, uniform, and standardized approach that could easily be replicated by the public and could easily be updated in the years to come without having to shift methodologies every time we update. We knew that while in the short term this may create bumps, in the long term it would establish greater certainty in the market. For regions that did not have data going back that far, we used the maximum available number of years through 2012. Each plot is assigned a site class designation by FIA from a group of plots, and that attribute is incorporated into the FIA database. Olaf Kugler is here today, and he's been invited to explain how FIA develops its data and how we use that data for calculating common practice. We will both be available for questions, and I'm going to pause now to let him give his presentation and then pick up at the end to provide a bit more detail on our common practice estimations before we open up our discussion for Q&A. Olaf, to you.
Good morning. My name is Olaf Kugler. I'm a statistician with the U.S. Forest Service, PNW Research Station in Portland, Oregon. I'm just going to give a brief overview about FIA and how it relates to the common practice and the ARB. So just brief background, what is FIA? It is a program created by the Forest Service in 1928. It was initially an inventory of marketable timber and with permanent field plots established. And there were periodic data collection at the time. Plots were sampled within 1 to 3 years and reassessed here in the West every 10 years. It's now an annual inventory of all forest land, of all ownership across all forest land. All plots are measured on a 5 to 10 year cycle, and it follows a nationally standardized measurement protocol. FIA is a national program with 4 regions of working units. We are Pacific Northwest in the West, Interior West, Northern Station, and the Southern. And I'm in Portland, Oregon, where the star is. Just a bit background history. FIA has a diverse history with a lot of different plot layouts, not just within one region, but through time. East and West was very different. And as you can see in this slide, the plot layout, these were different plot layout just in the West over the time. But now it is actually a national inventory with nationally standardized measurement protocols, which is, it has a set of core measurements done everywhere with the same protocol, and a set of core optional measurements done regionally with the same protocol. So this really allows us to, an analysis like this across the entire United States would have probably not been possible 20 years ago because of all these different protocols and all these different methods of measuring. And we also have some regional protocols. And FIA is really a neutral data provider. We don't judge. The data is publicly available at this link, fia.fs.fed.us/tools-data. And we also have, it can be either downloaded, the FIA Data Mart, or it can be, there's an online tool. Online estimation tools are also available, FIDO, Validator. Next slide. So inventory sample design is basically conceptually a whole grid of hexagons are laid over the entire Earth, and with one of the hexagons basically covering the entire United States, well, without Alaska and Hawaii, obviously. They're in a separate hexagon. Within these big country cell hexagons, we have local local hexagons that are further subdivided, and just where you see up below, the phase 2 where the plots located. So within each one of those hexagons, we have one plot located. Let me go on and show you just an example. And the next slide, for example, so if you have a 5-year cycle, Bob has mentioned we have 5 to 10 year cycles, 5 years, 7 years, and 10 years. This is an example of a 5-year cycle. So these are the hexagons you see. In the middle, the green dots are plot locations. So for example, the first year in 2001, we would have measured all the orange plots. So all the plots with the orange hexagons. We would go out and measure all those plots. Next year in 2002, we would go to the blue areas, 2003 to the green areas, 2004, and then 2005 to the yellows. And so this would be considered one cycle. And then in 2006, we would go back to the plots we'd measured in 2001, and the new cycle would start. And this would be continuing until endlessly. So the FIA cycle length was in 1998, the Farm Bill mandated a 5-year cycle, but mandate doesn't mean financing it. So basically, PNW Interior West Research Station were federally funded for a 10-year cycle, and the Northern and Southern research stations are federally funded for a 7-year cycle. However, some states pay for a 5-year cycle, so that's why you have these 5-year, 7-year, and 10-year cycles. And due to reduced funding, this may change in the future. So a state where we have 5-year cycle may increase to 7 or 10 years in the future. The FAA field plot design is we have basically 4 subplots, 24 feet, where we measure all trees greater than 5-inch diameter and where we measure understory vegetation. We also have an offset microplot of 6.8 feet where we measure tally seedling and saplings. We have an optional macroplot of 58.9 where we measure large trees or saplings. Macroplot is mainly done here in the west because we have the large trees. And we have an optional 1 hectare plot where we measure very large trees. That's been done in the, for example, in the Forest Service land in the west here where we measured extremely large trees. And we also have an optional lichen plot at 120 feet where we measure diversity and abundance of lichens. And transects where we measure coarse and fine woody debris and also collect ground cover data. Just a quick word about the U.S. Forest Service ecosections. The ecosections are spatial units that have similar physical and biological components. They were developed by the U.S. Forest Service, not by FAA, as far as I know, but by the U.S. Forest Service. And this is a graphical representation. The supersections are basically U.S. Forest Service ecosections were combined by the Climate Action Reserve CAR into supersections if they shared similar environmental, economic, and regulatory attributes. And supersections were later adopted by ARB. Assessment areas are combined similar FIA forest types into forest communities. And the forest communities are broken up by high side, low side class within the supersections. Estimation followed the GTR SRS 80. We called it lovingly the Green Book of Doom. And it's a design-based inference framework. It's not a model-based inference framework we're working with. All estimates are based on the temporal indifference methods, 5 to 10 year averages as outlined in the GTR. And they also the common practice estimates are also ratio of means estimates per acre. And I'll just give an example in a minute here, what that really means. For example, the White Mountains mixed hardwoods. This assessment area is comprised of mixed hardwoods, as the name implies, so which is FIA forest types 503 and all those listed there. And this was done again, just to reiterate, by CAR. CAR had grouped these mixed hardwoods into these FIA forest types into the mixed hardwoods. It comprises also of all site classes, and it's within the U.S. Forest Service ecosection M211A, which is White Mountains. The original date was 2002 through 2006, and we combined basically all plots between 2002 and 2006 to estimate total CO2 and total acres within the assessment area, and then divided the total CO2 by the total acres, and that's meant by the ratio of means. So, for example, the combined estimate between 2002 and 2006, the CO2 was 5.1 million tons of CO2. We had 101,000 acres in that area, so take 5.1 million divided by 101,000 acres, and we get a common practice value of 50.4 CO2 tons per acre. Now fast forward 2008 through 2012. Same area, we have slightly less volume here, 5.0 million tons. The area is a bit more, 102,000 acres. So again, the ratio is 5 million divided by 102, which equals 48.7 CO2 tons per acre. So as a comparison, previous common practice was 50.4 CO2 per acre, and now the new common practice value was 48.7 CO2 per acre. And I think this will end my presentation. Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ola. So we began by reviewing the original site class groupings, meaning we analyzed how site class groupings were established for the original data. We changed the site class groupings because we needed to use, one, more recently measured plots, and we needed to develop a consistent and standard and updatable, replicable approach. We've had issues where people tried to query the FIA data at home, comparing it to the common practice values published, and could not. And there are specific reasons why that has occurred, and one of the reasons we're updating is to try to make our common practice values much easier to replicate. The groupings that went into high or low site class for the original version varied from site class combinations, meaning site class groupings that made up the high site class were variable. They went from one site class, including site class groupings 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, and 1 and 5, and they were identified as high. And the reason for that, I think, was because they were trying to create a distribution that was evenly distributed between the high and low site classes. There are many different ways that this can be done, and this was the way that CAR chose to approach it. As you can see, this chart shows the original and the new numbers. The values here represent the number of assessment areas. So under the site class, the high site class, one assessment area included just site class 1 and 2. 11 assessment areas included site class 1 through 3. The majority of site classes in the original common practice value estimates fell into site class 1 through 4 categories. There were 69. And then the remaining were site class 1 through 5. If you look at the low, we see the same situation happening here for the original site class groupings, where you've got 3 through 7 having 1, the majority being 5 through 7 at 68. So we initially looked at this data to try to determine what would be the most consistent approach while creating greater replicability and updating the data fairly easily. So if we were to split high and low site classes 1 through 3 and 4 through 7, we would have had to do a significant reorganization of assessment areas because there were either not enough plots within the high and low groupings. As you can see, there were only 11 assessment areas that fell into the high site class 1 through 3. The protocol states that a high site class means Forest Service types 1, 2, and 3 and correlates to the Dunning timber sites 1 and 2. It identifies low site classes as Forest Service types 4 through 7 and correlates to Dunning timber sites 3 through 5. We're going to develop some guidance as to how to address this when you're practically making a determination for stratifying. But as it stands now, the updated January version, again, does not include these updated common practice values. Most project operators assumed that the high and low site class breakdown, which determined common practice, follows the Forest Service types 1 through 3 and 4 through 7 rule. But this rule was a simple rule of thumb. In practice, the breakdown used to determine high and low site class was actually variable. For ARB's purposes, we needed an approach that could allow people to duplicate it, be consistent across all assessment areas and regions, would not require reorganizing assessment areas because that might require us to also reorganize supersections for each update, and would allow us to provide certainty in the market by establishing an approach that allows data to be easily updated over time. This chart, along with the low site class designation, next slide, please. Thank you. This chart, along with the low class site designation, called the chart coming up next, shows a general pattern of growth over all assessment areas. As you can see, looking at the zero, what's the growth over zero, this indicates that the market has seen a general pattern of increased forest growth and reduced harvest on average. On average, high and low site class assessment values went up. Where there are outliers, we analyze each outlier to determine if the reason for the shift related to data, disturbance, or changes in the way FIA collects data. Where data issues were identified, we fixed those. Some assessment areas were adjusted. And in some assessment areas, there were significant changes from the original data. This may be due to the fact that no data existed for some years in the original span from years 2002 to 2006. For example, in New Mexico, data wasn't collected until the end of that period. And we can address some of the practical issues as to how this might affect FIA collection and reporting data. ARB is dependent upon FIA for its National Forest Carbon Accounting. It allows us to work with the most up-to-date values, but we are also subject to the limitations that FIA faces. If you can switch it to the next slide. You can see that the low site class common practice values are also trending essentially above zero, where you can see growth has occurred both in the low site classes as well as in the high site classes. It's most likely due to market shift from the period of time of 2006 to 2012. FIA allows us to work with the most up-to-date and available data possible, but we are also subject to limitations that FIA faces with regard to funding. As the market matures, there may be potentially greater interest in supporting FIA greenhouse gas inventory, so that we'll see more data collection and more standardized data collection across all regions of the country. Next slide, please. Here are a few examples of old and new common practice values. As you can see, increased growth in both the high and low site class groupings from old and updated data can be seen in the Adirondacks and Green Mountain conifers, both low and high, going from 90 to 97, 84 to 89, and in the northern hardwoods, also increasing. You can also see that the Blue Mountain conifers show a slight decline, while juniper pinyon woodland in the Blue Mountains see a slight increase. Where we had an adequate number of plots, such as with the Blue Mountain juniper pinyon woodland, there were likely not enough plots in the site classes associated with the high or low site class to split into high or low classes. Therefore, they're identified as all. And where plots were too few in one grouping, we had to combine those into all. Next slide, please. Our post-December board hearing activities will include public workshops and technical work groups, where after that board hearing, we'll have an opportunity to work with stakeholders on the specific technical aspects of the protocol update proposed when we release the initial proposal in October. We will return to the board in mid-2015 for a second board hearing. Next slide, please. Here are the websites that you can go to look at the 15-day modifications for the September board package. And any written comments may be submitted to our webpage here by October 17th. And as I stated earlier, the December board package will be released on October 21st and will be available. And you will be receiving notification on where to find that as well. And with that, I'll turn this over to Jessica. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Stu, actually, not Jessica, but I want to thank Jessica, Barb, and Olaf for those great presentations. Now we'd like to open up the webinar for questions, and we will keep our presenters on the line for answers. We've been receiving questions during the presentation, so I'll go ahead and read one question at a time in the order that they were received. The first question is for Barb, and if we have a project under the October 11th, 2010 protocol and decide to adopt the January 1, 2015 protocol, do we have to update the baseline and incorporate the new common practice values?
So you would have to update the baseline and all other quantification if you used volume equations that did not match the volume equations that are approved for the January 1 version. So if your volume equation is different than the one that's in the Woodall paper, then you would need to update those common practice. You need to update, the volume estimates and therefore the biomass and carbon estimates. That's across the board, not just for the baseline, but also for the project activity as well. With regard to the new common practice values, those were not incorporated into the version that would go potentially into effect on January 1st. So while you can update using the new volume equations, you would not need to use the new common practice values.
Okay. Now, here's a simple question. Barb, you may need to go back in your presentation a couple of slides, but we had a question about what was on the x-axis on the change in high site class common practice values graph. That one and that one. Yeah.
Okay, that is the percentage difference of change.
So the x-axis is the numbers.
Oh, I'm sorry. The x-axis are the assessment areas. So over 200 assessment areas that are identified with these points. And if you have a specific question, I can answer that offline.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question for Olaf. Could you confirm that the current common practice CO2 values were calculated with the current CAR ARB volume equations on the ARB website, whereas the new CO2 values are completely based on the newly required Woodall volume equations? Is there an inherent difference in the CO2 values due to the change in volume equations?
As far as I know, those are the volume equations as far as I know. I obviously don't compute the volumes myself. They were done nationally by our national compilation system. As far as I know, those are the volume equations. I don't know if there's any inherent differences in the CO2 values due to the change in volume equations. We oftentimes, I can speak more to the West, we oftentimes change the volume equations if we have better volume equations available or if there are some errors we have to fix. Sorry, go ahead, Barb.
And I can just add to that. The volume equations that went into the original common practice values are consistent with the volume equations that are in the Woodall paper. What the Woodall paper does and has are additional volume equations that we did not adopt, and they were just simply either left out of the list of volume equations, or the way that the coefficients and references documents are laid out, it's that they're identified by species, and those volume equations were identified for the same species regardless of region. So where there are differences, it lies in different volume equations that are used for different regions for the same species. And there are also additional volume equations that are found in the Woodall paper that were incorporated in the original common practice values, but we didn't adopt those volume equations, so project operators were not able to use them.
Okay, thanks, you guys. We only have one other question at the moment, and that has to do with extending projects outside of the United States. Barb, would you like to take that? We have an individual from Nigeria wanting to know if a new project can be extended there.
We're not accepting projects right now outside of the United States. The protocol is specific to this protocol, the current version, is specific to the lower 48. We will be adding portions of Alaska as part of our update, but it is restricted to the continental U.S. and Alaska.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question that has come in. Were the Woodall equations used in California to calculate common practice?
No, they were not. We used the regional biomass and volume estimates, equation estimates, to calculate common practice values for California, Oregon, and Washington. And as I mentioned earlier, project operators are going to want to take care, because we did not adopt the Woodall paper for use in California, Oregon, and Washington. It's only available for use for the other 45 states. We did adopt an update to the regional volume equations that are for California, Oregon, and Washington. Those are what was used to develop the common practice values, because those are what is used by FIA to report carbon value estimates. And Olaf, please jump in here if you have anything else to add to that.
No, I don't have anything to add here. That's usually the numbers. Those are usually equations we use to report on carbon.
Okay, another question for you, Barb. Some questions are coming in now. So how would the new common practice affect the issuance of offset credits?
The new common practice values shouldn't have any effect on issuance. If they are adopted as part of the December package, they would be basically effective the date that the December version would be adopted by the board, or shortly thereafter. So there should be no effect on issuance. And it's not going to, there's not going to be any required change in, if your project is operating under an existing version, you still continue to use the existing version unless you choose to update.
Okay. Barb, this is another question for yourself. Can you give us an update on the inclusion of state lands or public land baselines?
Yes, happy to do that. We're working on it right now, and we're hoping to have a draft by December or January. We don't have an exact date, but it's actually in process right now. And we will be developing that as a priority, and we should be completed sometime in the next few months. We'll have something for public lands.
Okay. I'm going to follow with one more question for you, Barb, and then there's a question for you, Olaf. Barb, when would the rule changes that include the common practice value changes and Alaska inclusion go into effect if approved by the board? You might have already talked about
that. We're anticipating going back to the board in mid-2015. Once it's approved by the board, it would be the quarter after adoption that would actually go into effect. So if it is adopted by the board in the summer of 2015, it would go into effect in
probably the end of the year, maybe. Depends on how quickly we can wrap up the FSOR, the final statements of reasons, get it to Office of Administrative Law, and get it published in the California Code of Regulations.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Olaf, question for you. You mentioned that the volume equations are calculated at the national level. Can you confirm that the volume equations used at the national level are in fact the Woodall equations and not the national volume estimators?
Sorry, when I said national level, what I meant was we have a national compilation system. It's a big Oracle database and compilation system. But the volume equations that are used inside the Oracle, this database, are the different volume equations. So, for instance, the ones we've used here in the West, it was not from the Woodall paper. So they're not just one volume equation for one species across all the United States. I hope that clarifies that. I'm not sure if he means anything else, or if the question is asking a different question.
I'll move on to another question, and that asker can consider that. Let's see. Can developing? I'm sorry. Pardon me, everybody. What are the advantages for projects that follow the current protocol to convert to the updated protocol?
You know, I think you'd have to, as a project operator, I think you'd really have to do the math, do the calculations, see if there might be benefits, or there may be. It's going to be on an individual case-by-case basis. I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, I know I can't answer that across the board. The greatest value in terms of using the January 1 version is that you have more volume equations available to you that are really specific to those species. So it's going to be more accurate, and it's going to be more consistent with what follows over the next number of years. And it's also going to be much more closely aligned with the common practice values that are updated over time.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Pardon me. Thanks, Barb. One more question here for you. Do the new common practice values include trees below 5 inches DBH?
Yes, they go to 1 inch, I believe. I'd have to check. I think it's 1 inch, but they're calculated from I think 0.9 to 4.9. They're calculated using the Jenkins equation. I'm going to turn this over to Olaf to identify, but I believe they're not measured in the same way as trees that are measured 5 inches and above. Olaf, do you have anything to add to that?
It will help when I unmute my. Well, we do measure trees 1 through 5 inch on the 1 through 5 inch on the microplot. I just have to look at my scripts. I believe we use the 1 inch and above, but I have to confirm that. It'd take me a few minutes here.
As a follow-up to that, Olaf, did the old common practice values include trees that were less than or equal to 5 inches?
We did the same thing both times. That I know. Just hang on. Just give me a couple of minutes here.
I can go to a question for Barb, Olaf, while you consider that.
Good. Yeah.
Barb, with regards to the standing dead requirements, did you mention that the requirement is changing to 3% of total stocks? Is there still a requirement that 1 ton carbon of standing dead will be in the project?
Yes, there's still a requirement. No, the requirement is not changing to 3% of total carbon stocks. What I said is that 3% or less is typically the amount of total carbon stocks in terms of total carbon stocks that standing dead tree carbon pool contributes to a project.
All right. One more question for Barb. Are the updated California regional equations available for review?
They're available to be, absolutely, they're available, and they're on our supplementary.
They're actually on the Cap and Trade website where we post all the updated protocols. So if you go to the main Cap and Trade webpage, look for the the 2014 regulatory documents, they'll be on there.
Yeah, and if you follow the link that we have in the slide presentation, you should find them. And if you have any problems, just email us and we'll send you the link. Just be sure that they're dated September 19th, 2014, both for volume and for biomass equations.
Okay, we're getting a few more questions here. Barb, I think this next one is for you. The Donkey paper on standing dead wood offers reduction values for 2 species only, aspen and Douglas fir. It is not clear how to apply these values across the U.S. Will ARB be issuing guidance on the use of these values in the near future?
Yes, we're going to be issuing guidance on, and we'll also be, we may be setting up not just guidance, but additional discussions with stakeholders to talk about how to use the Domke equation, how to use the Domke paper, as well as the Woodall paper. So we'll be doing that sometime before January 1st.
Okay, we have a few more questions about standing dead here. Is Olaf, are you trying to speak?
Yeah, I just want to interject here. So we did use 1 inch and above.
You did use 1 inch and above. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks for that. Next question here, is standing dead included in the common practice values?
No, it's not. It's only standing live carbon values, as I believe. Olaf?
No, we only have standing live. Yeah, not dead.
That's one of the reasons why when you calculate your baseline, you first have to look at your initial standing live carbon stocks, and you don't include all the other carbon pools.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here. Are there going to be flexible standing dead requirements in the future? For instance, a requirement of 1 ton of carbon on an assessment area with a common practice of 50, as well as one for 200. Doesn't seem to make sense. Can you see that question, Barb? So I can read it again if you like.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, other than that, whether there's going to be a flexible standing dead requirement. Mm-hmm. We don't have, I mean, other than in terms of adjusting for standing dead carbon pools, for missing, our rotten portions, we don't really have a specific, I'm not sure what they mean by flexible, but it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it flexible.
I think it's in regards to the common practice value. Perhaps the person can ask that question again, the second half. Maybe I'll move on to the next question, Barb. Is Harmon 2011 required for California standing dead wood computation, or is it still optional?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I believe we do require Harmon, but I need to get back to you on that one.
Okay. A couple more here. Barb, is standing dead wood required